Good morning. Our reflection today will come from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 24, verses 13 to 35. Luke 24, verses 13 from 35. If you have a hard time finding it, I will help you like I help my students. It's between Genesis and Revelation. Luke 24, 13 to 35. And this is what it says. And behold, two of them were going that very day to a village named Emmaus, which is about 7 miles from Jerusalem. And they were talking with each other about all these things that had taken place. While they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself approached and began traveling with them. But their eyes were prevented from recognizing him. And he said to them, "What are these words that you are exchanging with one another as you were walking?" And they stood still, looking sad. One of them, named Cleopas, answered and said to him, "Are you the only one visiting Jerusalem and unaware of the things which have happened here in these days?" And he said to them, "What things?" And they said to him, "The things about Jesus the Nazarene, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word in the sight of God and all the people, and how the chief priests and our rulers delivered him to the sentence of death and crucified him. But we, hoping that it was he who was going to redeem Israel. Indeed, beside all this, it is the third day since the things happened. But also some women among us amazed us when they were at the tomb early in the morning and did not find his body. They came saying they had also seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just exactly as the woman had said. But him they did not see. And he said to them, "O foolish men and slow of heart to believe in all the prophet had spoken. Was it not necessary for the Christ to suffer these things and to enter into his glory?" Then, beginning with Moses and with all the prophets, he explained to them the things concerning himself in all the scriptures. And they approached the village where they were going, and he acted as though he were going farther. But they urged him, saying, "Stay with us, for it is getting towards evening, and the day is now nearly over." So he went in to stay with them. When he had reclined at the table with them, he took the bread and blessed it, and breaking it, he began giving it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. They said to one another, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he was speaking to us on the road, while he was explaining the scripture to us?" And they got up that very hour and returned to Jerusalem, and found gathered together the 11 and those who were with them, saying, "The Lord has really risen and has appeared to Simon." They began to relate the experience on the road and how he was recognized by them in the breaking of the bread. This is the word of the Lord. Now, if you have been a church goer for a while, you may have noticed something unusual. This text, the text of the disciples on the road to Emmaus, is not a text for this season. If you already gone or will go to a Thanksgiving service, you most likely is going to hear a sermon preached on text of the likes of Psalm 95. "Come, let us sing unto the Lord, let us make a joyful noise to the rock of our salvation." Or even Psalm 9, "I will give thanks to you, Lord, with all my heart. I will tell of all your wonderful deeds." Or even 1 Thessalonians 5:8. As a matter of fact, our president, Moisés Rodriguez, posted 1 Thessalonians 5:8 on Facebook. I'm stalking you on Facebook, sir. I know it was there. And it says, "Give thanks in all things, for this is God's will for you in Christ Jesus." The Revised Common Lectionary for this Thanksgiving season uses as his epistle reading Philippians 4. "Rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I will say, rejoice." This text, however, the text of the disciples on the road to Emmaus, is usually understood as an Eucharistic text, as a text that has in its core message the idea that Jesus is more strongly present and most clearly identifiable in the communal breaking of the bread. But make no mistake, we need to learn, not reasons, but we need to learn to be thankful, especially in a world surrounded by complaint. We don't need to look far. The Bible itself is full of complaints. I don't know if you noticed, but most psalms are psalms of complaint, what Walter Brueggemann calls psalms of disorientation. The Old Testament prophets complained about the people all the time, maybe even as much as you complain about your own roommates or co-workers. Some, like Jonah, even complain about God's very plan. And I suspect that in this regard, we are not very different from them. We are complainers, and we need to be reminded that we must be thankful. Even the holiday itself is not free from complaint. When Abraham Lincoln in 1863 tried to establish a national Thanksgiving Day, many complained. The Southern Confederate States, Texas included, complained that the initiative was unacceptable for being yet another overreach of a government that was becoming too powerful and were trying to make the free and noble Southerns conform. It was only during Reconstruction that a national Thanksgiving Day was established, and it had the additional political benefit of mending a national spirit that had been torn by war and violence during the Civil War. The myth of origins of the holiday, of course, is also not free from its own set of curiosities. The immigrants who came to a land that was not theirs, unannounced and unprepared, you may call them pilgrims, eventually will involve the initiatives that decimated native groups, like the Wampanoags, the Pequot, the Dakota. As a matter of fact, for decades, when a Thanksgiving Day was called in Massachusetts, it was called to celebrate the decimation of the Pequot. So, if you see Native Americans complaining that we are celebrating this day, there's a story behind it. And it's usually a story that our elementary school teachers leave out of their narrative for the good of the body. Nevertheless, I think that our universal spiritual meaning that we give to this holiday is important and necessary. We are complainers, and as complainers, we need to set a specific time aside for us to be reminded that we have reason to be thankful both as individuals and communities of faith. But sometimes being thankful is hard. Sometimes disillusionment sets in. And it's here, in the midst of disillusionment, in the midst of hopelessness, in the midst of disappointment, that we find these two disciples getting out from Jerusalem and going to Emmaus. These two disciples may have been among those who were with Jesus in Luke 10. If you remember the story, Jesus commissions 72 disciples to go out 2 by 2 to villages around the area in order to heal the sick and preach God's kingdom. They come back energized by all they have seen, with their commitment renewed to preach their understanding of Jesus' kingdom that had been inaugurated. But now on the road to Emmaus, all that seemed like a distant memory of an insignificant past. They also may have been among those that Luke mentions a few verses before on chapter 24, verse 9, who were among the disciples who got the news from the women that the tomb was empty. But that was not enough news for them, especially because the news was delivered by women who, in a patriarchal society, were not given full humanity. Be that as it may, they were here hopeless and saw themselves as people with very few reasons to be thankful for. The text says that on the road to Emmaus, these two men are discussing. The Greek terms are pros allelus and zizetel, which indicates to us that it was emotional. They were loud, they were discussing. They were debating, they were arguing. The exchange is so emotional that when Jesus, who they do not recognize, comes around and asks him, "What are you raising hell about?" That's the Southern translation. They, they just stop and look sad, perhaps wondering if it's even worthy to fill this stranger into their controversy. But Cleopas finally decides to answer. We don't know exactly who Cleopas is, and the other disciple remains unnamed, although Origen later identifies this disciple as a Simon, and the ancient church historian Eusebius says that this Simon was a distant relative of Jesus that eventually succeeded James as the bishop of Jerusalem. The text does not settle the matter. But Cleopas' answer opens a legion of issues, of complaints, of problems that comes out of his lack of thankfulness. Now, we may rush, as I think we do, to condemn Cleopas as someone whose disappointment was the result of a misunderstanding of the nature of Christ's kingdom. He definitely seems to think that Jesus' kingdom must have stronger political connotations. In a nationalistic tone, Cleopas said, "We had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel." Boy, he was wrong. Jesus' kingdom was not a political kingdom, at least not in the way he thought it should be. And he missed the memo. We may also feel tempted to point to the disciples' lack of faith, just like Jesus did. And as someone who has been in church for a while, I have come to find out that it's much easier for us to follow Jesus when Jesus condemns than it is when Jesus embraces. But there's no equivocation here. Jesus says, "Oh, foolish you are and slow of heart to believe that all the prophets have declared." But if we rush to identify Cleopas' shortcoming, we miss the legitimacy of his complaints. Cleopas recognized that the greatest obstacles to his conception of the mission of Jesus were his religious and political leaders. His disappointment is partially born out of a recognition that his own leaders and the leaders of the empire in which he lived were in direct opposition to his hopes and expectations. A couple of weeks ago, I was with a group of educators and ministers of color at Southern Methodist University. It was the weekend right after the election results came in. It was the same weekend in which students from that university were passing out pamphlets against relationship of mixed color in general and against relationships of white women with black men in particular. That same week in that same campus, fraternities took out Confederate flags in order to celebrate what they think is the new direction of this country. At Baylor, my alma mater, a sophomore, Natasha, was an African-American student, was pushed out the sidewalk by a man who thought that somehow that would make America great again. And what I heard from these students, from these ministers, and from these educators was shocking. A black Lutheran minister from Chicago told us that the night before, when she was trying to get to the airport, she walked out the door and she was petrified by the fact that there was a police car outside her house with the lights on. Now, she knows that most police officers are good people, and most of them are concerned with the protection of our communities. But her memory is full of unarmed black and women being brutalized by law enforcement, sometimes being killed by the state. And the church said very little about it. She can't forget something that sometimes we do, that whatever else the church in America is, it is the church that lynched. A Mexican-American minister from St. Louis told us that he was shocked by the fact that right before he came to Texas, a group of people painted a message in his wall, in the wall of the church, a message that has become a chant of hatred in schools and workplaces across the nation. Build a wall, he said. Oh, he knows that racism is nothing new in America, nor is it the monopoly of one political party. But they do feel that something different is going on. They sense something different in the air. They are fearful. So this Thanksgiving, perhaps more so than any other Thanksgiving in the last few years, there are groups of people in this country who are feeling similarly to these disciples on the road to Emmaus. They feel like their hopes have been destroyed. They feel like the developments of the last few weeks in the political direction of their country has given them more reasons to be fearful than to be thankful. Much like the disciples in the road to Emmaus, many people in this country, maybe some of you included, are feeling like their hopes for the future they wanted were not going to come to fruition. They are feeling fearful and unsafe. They are asking themselves, how can I be thankful in the midst of disappointment? They are coming to this season feeling sort of like those described in Psalm 137, one of those psalms of disorientation. Feeling like people who are being asked to sing songs of joy when it's really time to cry. And our temptation may be doing with these sentiments, especially in this season, the same things that we attempted to do with the story of the disciples in the road to Emmaus, to pass over the legitimacy of their feelings to rush to the end of the story. What Cleopas and his companions did not recognize was that Jesus was alongside them the whole way. They did not recognize Jesus, but Jesus heard their complaints. He listened their pain. He corrected their course. When they realized that they gotten the story wrong, that Jesus' kingdom was not a political kingdom in the way they thought it was, they had a new perspective on reality. They regained reason to be hopeful, to be excited, to be thankful. And then they ran back to Jerusalem, where they should not have left in the first place. The problem of Cleopas and his companions was a problem of blindness, was a problem of misrecognition. They were too in love with their political expectations to recognize that their relationship with Jesus was much more important than concerns about who was sitting on the emperor's throne. And that realization opened up their eyes to the possibility of thankfulness in the midst of disappointment, in the midst of hopelessness, in the midst of sorrow. But that does not mean that some of their concerns suddenly disappeared. They were indeed part of a people who wanted to be free from the aggressive Roman Empire. The experience in the road to Emmaus did not change that. The empire was still there, and early Christians were very critical of it. It was their religious leaders who spearheaded the crucifixion of Jesus. The experience in the road to Emmaus did not change that. The leaders were still there. And Jewish Christians were very much aware they could not trust them anymore. When Jesus corrects Cleopas, he does not correct Cleopas' description of reality. Cleopas got that kind of right, actually. Cleopas recognized that his Jewish people lived in an oppressed people in an antagonistic empire. Check. He also acknowledged that his religious leaders, who belonged to this very dominated people, sometimes partnered with the empire against the best interest of their people in order to maintain their comfortable religious positions in their institutions. Check. Is interested that on those matters, history at times repeats itself. Jesus never challenges Cleopas' diagnostic, but he does challenge his expectation of a political kingdom that replaces the one he does not like. And by doing that, by showing Cleopas and his companion that his kingdom is about much more than political power, Jesus expands their imagination so that they can be thankful despite the social, cultural, political tensions of their environment. They then go back to Jerusalem and away from safety. Not because the visible conditions of their society had changed, not because Jesus had usurped the earthly crown of the emperor, but because now they understood Jesus' kingdom and were ready to be thankful despite all that. In a couple of days, most of us are going to join family and friends for a Thanksgiving meal. Some of us, we do like we did last year and consider gluttony to be a patriotic duty. We will laugh and sing and pray and listen to stories we already know and laugh at jokes we've already heard and more. But I suspect that this year will be different from last year and the year before. If your family and friends are in any way like mine, there will be people there who are still broken by a divisive political campaign and some of the things that followed Trump's election. Others will be very happy, maybe you count yourself among those, by the new direction of this country. And when we gather on Thursday, tensions may be high, but we need to be wise and discern that some of the reasons for despair may be legitimate, like those of Cleopas. And that in the process of defending this or that ideology, dismissing these concerns may not be the best path for reconciliation and true understanding. Those in despair, the overwhelming majority of racial, ethnic, and religious minorities in this country, are reminded by the story of the disciples in the road to Emmaus that despite the fact that Jesus never promised to give us complete social, cultural, economic comfort, he does walk with us even when we do not see him. And there is much more to his kingdom than political victory. And if you are going into Thursday's dinner asking yourself, like I'm asking myself, how can I be thankful in the midst of disappointment, in the midst of hopelessness? Can I be thankful in the midst of hopelessness and in the midst of disappointment? This story teaches us, yes, you can, even if you don't feel like it.